This is a very weird gospel. To be honest, I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and where I do believe that the gospel connects with us this morning is when Jesus is talking and speaking in these parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. I don't believe that he's just making an argument for why it's not logically likely that he would be a worshiper of demons. How can I worship demons? How can I cast them out and worship them at the same time? I believe in this moment he is condemning the scribes from Jerusalem who are going after and waging war against someone like Jesus, instead of and effectively undermining the mission of God. That how can a house stand if the clergy and holy people are seeking out and condemning one another? And perhaps in the same way, how can our nation and church stand if we continue to remain divided and at least legally against one another rather than with one another? I'm going to read to you some of this section from the Truth and Reconciliation Executive Summary. I'm actually going to recommend to Parish Council next week that we get a bound copy of that document. It's a 388-page document. It's incredibly well written, and there's a lot of powerful things that we need to read in it. I commend to you anyone that it's all available now on the website, but if you want a copy, we can easily email you the PDF, and there should be one in our library, hopefully in the next few months. This is the passage from that document. As commissioners, we believe that reconciliation is about respect. That includes both self-respect for Aboriginal people and mutual respect among all Canadians. All young people need to know who they are and from where they come. Aboriginal children and youth searching for their own identities and places of belonging need to know and take pride in their Indigenous roots. They need to know the answers to some very basic questions. Who are my people? What is our history? How are we unique? Where do I belong? Where is my homeland? What is my language? And how does it connect me to my nation's spiritual beliefs, cultural practices, and ways of being in the world? They also need to know why things are the way they are today. That requires an understanding of the history of colonization, including the residential school system and how it has affected their families, communities, their people, and themselves. Of equal importance, non-Aboriginal children and youth need to comprehend how their own identities and family histories have been shaped by a version of Canadian history that has marginalized Aboriginal people's history and experience. They need to know how notions of European superiority and Aboriginal inferiority have tainted mainstream society's ideas about and attitudes towards Aboriginal peoples in ways that have been profoundly disrespectful and damaging. They, too, need to understand Canada's history as a settler society and how assimilation policies have affected Aboriginal peoples. This knowledge and understanding will lay the groundwork for establishing mutually respectful relationships. It's a very well-written document. I was actually surprised at how riveted I was. There's an introduction, an amazing history passage. It's very well done. It's not so much, there are legal suggestions in it. There's a huge amount of recommendations, but what affected me most as someone who was going to be preaching the following day was how powerful it acknowledges shared history is, how powerful our sense of identity is, how powerful spirituality is. Even when the residential schools were set up, there was an acknowledgement that they were going to be removing the spiritual practices of the Aboriginal boys and girls that would be going there, and thus it was essential to put some other kind of spiritual practice in its place. Tragically, we leapt as a church at the opportunity of creating more Anglicans, much to our discredit. But for me, to be honest, this really affected me profoundly on a lot of levels. There's a great line that clergy, especially young clergy, like to hear. I heard this great story. It was said, someone came up to a priest and he said, "You're too young to be a priest." And he said, "When I wear the stole, I am 2,000 years old." It's a great line. I feel like that's like an interclergy line that we say to one another, because I don't know how I would say that to you. It's by my authority, But I really, truly love the history of the church. I mean, any of you that know me or listen to these sermons I give, I love church history. And it was with profound humility and sadness that I read about this chapter in our church's history. We really messed up a lot on so many levels. This passage from Samuel this morning talking about the great price that the people of Israel pay by seeking to have a great king that will lead them to war like other great kings. We had an empire. We had the British Empire, and we loved it. We loved it so much, and it led us so far astray when we helped to colonize a people from within. We offered free labor. These schools were drastically underfunded, and the reason initially why they were so underfunded was because it was believed that there would be so much agriculture and work done on these schools that they would pay for themselves. Why was there going to be so much work? Well, it was a dual combination of a certain kind of racism and also a deep military fear. If we educate these people too much, it was thought they might become dangerous. And at the very same time, I'm not sure these people are capable of being educated. And so we'll teach them how to work on the land, and we'll teach them to become factory workers, and teach them the Lord's Prayer and the national anthem, and we'll be good to go. So a lot of people left these schools not having any education at all. There's exceptions, of course, in both cases. But as a result, we, as a church, sent a lot of missionaries. We weren't sending a lot of teachers. We weren't sending the kinds of people that would have taught at an Anglican school around the turn of the 20th century, right? When I think of a church run by the Church of England, or a school run by the Church of England, I think of someone that may have graduated from Oxford and Cambridge that teaches all the great subjects, and we weren't sending those people. We were mostly sending missionaries. And we were sending missionaries to bring the gospel, but a very simplified gospel. And these were missionaries who were willing to work for virtually nothing. And we don't have a good history as a church of sending exceptional people to very dangerous places. Right? A long time ago, in the Middle Ages, sometimes we sent our very best people out into the wilderness, right? And they built a library, and then they built a monastery, and people flooded to this beacon of learning and growth, right? That's sort of the Middle Ages is filled with these amazing monks that settle in the middle of nowhere. We would have not sent those people. We would have sent people that maybe we struggled with, maybe we couldn't find a place for them, and they would have worked for next to nothing. And some of the employees finished out their tenure without any kind of pension. And a great many terrible things happened. The kids were not fed properly. There was rampant disease. Rates of tuberculosis were 3, 4, I think 5 times higher in the 1920s. And as a church, we weren't really aware or willing to know what was going on. I really encourage you to read this document. It is very humbling. And for me in particular, someone who loves the history of the church, in a way, I'm not nearly as pride-filled as I was even a week ago. I will admit that as we walked in a parade, and I held aloft the Anglican banner, and I knew that our bell was being rung, I felt proud to be a part of a moment of reconciliation. But this Sunday, I feel a deep humility and sadness and shame as I wear the priestly stole, knowing that I'm part of an institution and a history that is almost unforgivable. And I say almost because somehow there is a nation that lives in our midst that's been around for struggling with a government that's attempted to destroy it for 200 years. There is a thriving nation that lives in our midst, filled with life and love and hope, and somehow filled with forgiveness and a thirst for reconciliation. It's remarkably powerful. Remember the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, right? Forgiveness is something that you have to do on your own and for yourself, sometimes even if the other party is not willing to forgive, right? This is a people that has been forgiving us for decades as we've been kind of blithely going on with our lives as a church and as a nation. Forgiveness is something that we need to do in our own hearts so that we're not harboring resentment and anger and hatred. Reconciliation is something that we need to seek with another party. To be reconciled with someone, they need to come to you as much as you need to come to them and meet in the middle. To be reconciled means to have a shared sense of a desire for relationship. Reconciliation also implies that there's been conciliation, that you at one point have been conciliatory towards one another and something's happened and broken that relationship and now you need to reconciliate. Some people say that we were never conciliatory in the first place as two nations, so the word itself may be problematic. I encourage you to read this document as a part of our history as a nation and as a church and as individuals. There's no real way to escape it. I've heard some thoughts. Some people have said, well, it wasn't me. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. Well, actually, they closed in the 90s. Not just the kids, but their parents of many of these graduates of these schools and people who have attended these schools are still quite alive. We were all very much alive at this time as a church. There were some wonderful clergy and bishops who were not quite aware of that cultural genocide was happening under our watch. It's a part of our history. It's a part of my history. I encourage you to read it. I encourage you to think about it. For me, it's not, I don't know how to solve these things legally. We're looking at comparisons being the way that Germany has approached the aftermath of the Holocaust, the way the United States government has approached the aftermath of institutional slavery. It's very challenging to figure out how to pass laws and how to share property and all these things. I'm not proposing any kind of legal solution, although there are many, many very reasonable legal proposals in this document as well. But I think the harder work is changing our sense of story and narrative and identity and relationship, understanding of the world, understanding of who we are, changing our narrative, our life story. My memories of my church history that I lived has been nothing but wonderful. And we live in the midst of a people who encountered the very same symbols and rituals of our church in the midst of horror and deep fear. For our own spiritual health, we must be aware of that, so that we can seek reconciliation, fully aware of what the audacity of what we are trying to do by seeking to be reconciled. We are reconciling as a response to someone who is seeking our reconciliation when it's possible that they did not have to do that. It's with deep humility that we approach reconciliation. I encourage you to read this document so you'll know something more about who we are as a church and as a nation. Amen.